Well, why talk about giving this morning? Money is not exactly a topic that many of us are overly comfortable talking about, is it? For some of us, it's an awkward topic, especially if you're British here this morning. You probably found yourself shuffling around nervously in your seats when the topic was announced, just wanting the service done there and then. Anything but money. For others of us, it's a difficult topic. Money's tight, pressure's rising. Every time we're at the supermarket, prices seem higher. Every time we drive past the petrol station, we worry what petrol will cost now. Times are tough. And we thought the church was at least a safe space, a space where we didn't have to think about money for a precious hour or so. And so why are we talking about giving this morning? Well, there's all kinds of answers that we might want to give to that question. I mean, we could just point to the Bible's raw data and just note how dominant a theme that it is. Did you know that we're given more instructions about money than almost anything else? More than 2,000 verses. Jesus told many parables about it. The apostles spoke regularly about it. Well, if they weren't embarrassed to talk money, or perhaps neither should we. Or perhaps we should answer the question from a different angle. Perhaps we should just remind ourselves what church members here promise in the Carey Covenant. We promise to give financially to the church on a regular basis in order to further the Lord's work within our own fellowship and throughout the world. And that's one of just 9 things that we promise to promote the church's unity and health. Well, it's important sometimes, isn't it, to remind ourselves of what and why we promise. Indeed, alongside that, perhaps we might talk about just the practical realities of giving, of what our giving goes towards. Maybe the cynics amongst us jump straight there. It's all about your salary, you thought to yourself. Well, believe it or not, as a Brit myself, actually it makes it a rather awkward topic for the preacher too. But actually the practical realities go way beyond that. Or we might think of our church budget, and the pressures on it as we were talking about at our last members' meeting. Our desire to provide for everything that we do as a church. Well, that is certainly worthwhile to consider. Because you see, cynicism aside, there's good throughout all of those answers. They're good reasons to talk about giving. But actually, I want to take a step back today and just think from first principles. Now, that is why we're turning to 1 Chronicles 29. Perhaps not a passage that we're overly familiar with in our Bibles, but it's an extraordinary account of the Old Testament Israelites giving incredibly generously to provide for the temple building project. We read, didn't we, in verses 1 to 9 of the collection taken under King David so that his son Solomon could build the temple. Large quantities of fine resource, all that gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and onyx and turquoise and marble and, well, you name it. Add the numbers up. It's an extraordinary thing. But actually, what's even more extraordinary is what David says in verses 10 to 20. And that's where we're focusing today. Because in what David says, we find the underlying reasons, the underlying answers to the question. David gives us 3 reasons for why we shouldn't just talk money. We shouldn't just talk about giving, but actually give according to the resources and the opportunities that the Lord gives us. And so why give? Reason 1, because God is awesome. Because God is awesome. You know, how was such a large collection accomplished? I mean, that's a question we might want to ask as we think about our church finances. Well, you can imagine a reporter from the Jerusalem Times just roaming around the streets of Jerusalem asking that question and receiving all kinds of answers. Some pointing out what an exciting cause it was. A resplendent temple, matter of national pride even. Others waxing lyrical about how charismatic and inspirational David and Solomon were. And what a trustworthy finance team they had, led by this chap, Jehiel the Gershonite. The Graham Powell of the day, with great examples set by the leaders, those who were giving extraordinarily generously themselves. It was do as I do, not just do as I say in Israel. Well, all of that seems true. These were human factors explaining what happened, but behind that was an invisible reality, which the chronicler pulls the curtain back to show us from verse 10, to show us that there was far more than mere human factors at play. Because the reality is that God had worked in their hearts to give them a big view of his glory. You see, verse 10, David praised the Lord. He was amazed at the God he was giving to. You see, just think what we see in our world that is praiseworthy. Think of the glory of the skies on a clear night, or the power of a rugby pack driving unstoppably towards the try line, or the greatness of some wise, servant-hearted leader, or the splendor of something like the Grand Canyon. Things that take our breath away, things that leave us in wonder. And yet whatever we see, they are just the faintest of faint candle flickers compared with God. God alone is awesome. Look at verse 11. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor. The exact difference between each term is not the main point. It is just a pile-up of terms to say, God is awesome. There is no one or nothing that you can compare him with ultimately. He's utterly in a category of his own. That's what our opening song was getting at. What other beauty demands such praises? What other splendor outshines the sun? What other majesty rules with justice? Only a holy God. What other glory consumes like fire? What other power could raise the dead? What other name remains undefeated? Only a holy God. You see, God has such power that he speaks all things into being, with such majesty to accomplish all that he purposes. A God of such splendor that you should only bow before him, but with such infinite beauty that our souls find complete satisfaction when we behold his glory. You see, everything that's praiseworthy is created by him. He alone is the great uncreated creator. As David goes on to say, everything in heaven and earth are yours. And so praise should be returned to him, ultimately. He is the great king of heaven and earth. He is an invincible king. It's unlike what we see in world affairs, isn't it? We look around our world and we wonder which world leader will prevail in world events. But there's never any doubt with God. Verse 11 again, yours, O Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. And there's no superhero battle between God and others. God is the sovereign Lord of heaven and earth. He is the name that remains undefeated, who cannot but triumph. And so as we read in Psalm 96, great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. He is to be feared above all gods. And so David praises him. This awesome God who is unchanging, unchangeably like this, but also unchangeably for him. Verse 10, praise be to you, O Lord, God of our father Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Just as God was for the patriarchs, like Jacob, or Israel as he's called here, he's continued down the ages to be for his people right until David's day. The faithful God of the covenant who works for his people's good, providing from his infinite resources again and again. So verse 12, wealth and honor come from you. You are the ruler of all things. In your hands are strength and power to exalt and give strength to all. What a God. Indeed, it's precisely the same God, isn't it, that we're worshipping today. He never changes. As another psalmist says, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. The God we've been praising in song. the God we've been pleading with in our prayers, the God we've been hearing from in his word. This God is truly awesome. Indeed, we behold his glory most supremely in the face of Jesus Christ. The God of greatness and majesty and power and glory and splendor is the God who stoops low, the God who becomes one despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. But that was no accident or defeat. That was the greatest victory of all. He did it for his people. He did it for us. God has raised Jesus from the dead and seated him at the right hand of the Father. Such extraordinary power, so that even today we can have confidence that God has placed all things under his feet and appointed him head over everything for the church. You see, he continues to be invincible. He continues to build his church. Even as nations rage and kingdoms rise and fall, his purposes can never fail. And so we bow in awe, knowing that he has done it to bring true satisfaction to our souls, with his power working in his world and in us for our goods. We say, yours, O Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. God is awesome. And you see, it's this big vision of God that then fuels our giving. Sometimes organizations talk, don't they, a lot about their visions and their values, as though that were the sort of the thing that should get people to open their wallets. Now, hear me carefully. I'm not completely rejecting that. Don't want to become hyper-spiritual this morning. After all, remember the human factors that were at play here. It's important to have a sense of direction and coherence, to have a clear vision for what you're seeking to accomplish. But first and foremost, we need a big vision of God's glory. That is the fuel that drives our giving. Actually, that is our real concern here today. Yes, we're concerned for church finances. Yes, to provide for needs. But there is a bigger picture. Our concern fundamentally is that we would be taken up with the glory of our infinitely glorious God. For all the British awkwardness of talking money, that's why we're talking about it. Because our giving is an act of worship. Like David says in verse 13, here they are, they've brought all of their resource to God so this temple can be built. There it is before them, and he says, now our God, we give you thanks and praise your glorious name. Worship. Our giving is an expression of our attitude towards God. We come with whatever it is that we're able to give as an act of devotion. Why do we give? Because God is truly awesome. But then secondly, we give because God has given everything. God's given everything. Really, this is just an extension of our last point. But look at David's attitude in verse 14. As he sees what he's been able to give, think how he could have reacted. He could have been full of pride, couldn't he? Look at all we've done. All my resources to leave a legacy in my kingdom. Aren't I doing God a favor here? But there's none of that, is there? He says, who am I? And who are my people that we should be able to give as generously as this? He's utterly humbled that he should have this grace of giving, because you see, his right view of God gives him a right view of himself and his priorities. Indeed, look what he says next. However impressive he and his kingdom may be, well, he knows it's not ultimately his doing. What does he have which he's not first received? He says, everything comes from you, and we have only given you what comes from your hand. You see, God fills our hands so that we can bring our filled hands to him in return. It's a bit like the attitude that a child should have towards a loving mother on Mother's Day. And lots of the children aren't here to hear this part, so dads, feel free to share this when you get home later. But in a sense, you see, their mother has given them everything. They fed them and clothed them and cared for them and protected them and taught them, provided everything. And so on Mother's Day, the attitude of the child shouldn't be, should I have to? Or sort of begrudgingly, well, let's get them something, anything, ideally something quick and cheap. No, it's, I want to. Now, sure, it comes from the pocket money that she's first given them, but it's an expression of gratitude, knowing that nothing could ever be enough, but still that I can give to her. Well, it's the same for us. God fills our hands so that we can bring our filled hands to him in return, amazed that we can give him anything. And that is not just about the money. It's about all that he gives us. Come back to verse 12. Notice the variety of verse 12. Yes, God gives wealth, which the Israelites are giving with open hands for the temple. But he also gives strength and power. The kind that will be used by those mentioned back in verse 5. All those craftsmen that are doing the work. You see, it's not just about the money. Some of us are very blessed financially. We can give out of great abundance. But others of us are incredibly stretched. The cost of living's biting. We just about manage our responsibilities towards our family, but after that there's little left. Well, if that's you, please don't go away feeling guilt-tripped this morning. What you have is what God has provided. You might only be able to give the widow's mite, but you can still have that willing sense of amazement. Who am I? Which you can also have about everything that God has given you. Because some of us are cash poor, but time rich or energy rich, able to give through our service in the church, much like those craftsmen, or through our regular prayers for God's work. You see, we give according to the opportunities and the resources he gives with open hands. It's very easy to get tunnel vision sometimes, to think of what we have as mine. It was my skills and my hard work and my money and all those kind of my's. But you see, all of your skills and your strength and your temperament and life itself, all of it is given by God. It's a gift from the giver on loan to you to use for his glory. And so however we use it, we're to be left standing amazed saying, who am I? Well, you say, what cultivated that attitude here amongst these people? Well, especially it was a sense of amazement at God's grace. God's undeserved kindness to them of all people. So verse 15, David recognizes that they have no right to Israel, to the promised land. He says, we are aliens and strangers in your sight, as were all our forefathers. A striking way of talking, isn't it? They've settled there in the land, but David calls him and his people aliens and strangers because it's God's land. They're only there because of all God has done for them. Taking them out of Egyptian slavery, across the Red Sea, through the wilderness, defeating enemies in the land, only then to finally settle in their inheritance. Well, they couldn't do that themselves. It was God's doing. They've no right to that land. Indeed, they've no right to life itself. Verse 15 continues, our days on earth are like a shadow without hope. They only have their fleeting days because God has given it to them. And it's the same for us. Our spiritual and physical standing owes everything to God's generosity. Physically, your every breath is in his hands. Throughout this service, each of us will have had our hearts beating something like 5,000 times, something in that order. Well, each and every heartbeat is the gift of God. Spiritually too. We're reminded of that as we come to the Lord's Supper, especially in a few minutes. We're reminded of all that God has done for us at the cross. Think God has saved you from your proud and covetous, grasping life, that life of taking God's good gifts but refusing to worship the giver, living like everything was yours, which was driving you off an eternal cliff edge. But think what he saved you for, out of that slavery, to serve him with gladness, enjoying every spiritual blessing, heading to a promised eternal inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. And all at what cost? Well, our awesome God became a curse for us, bearing the full extent of God's wrath, his body torn, his blood poured out. He who was rich beyond all splendor, yet for love's sake became poor, so that through his poverty we might become rich. Well, we say, love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. Our attitude becomes that of verse 17, saying, I know, my God, that you test the heart and are pleased with integrity. All these things have I given willingly and with honest intent. You see, we don't give to earn God's favor. We simply give in response to God's favor. After all, we can't pull the wool over God's eyes. There's no point just sort of scraping off some leftovers begrudgingly. The Lord looks upon the hearts. And what he delights in is a cheerful giver who willingly gives because God has given everything. And so we give because God is awesome. We give because God's given everything. But then thirdly and finally, we give because God's kingdom is important. Because God's kingdom's important. Now, of course, as we consider this passage, there are obvious discontinuities, aren't there, between then and now. David and co. were building a physical temple some 3,000 or so years ago in Israel. And obviously we aren't called to do that. As we live 3,000 years later, the other side of the cross, well, things are different. And yet there is still a sense in which we're called to do precisely the same today. Because what was the temple all about? Look at verse 16. This giving was all for building you a temple for your holy name. The temple was God's house. It was the place that God dwelt amongst by his Spirit, amongst his people, the place that made his holy name known. Indeed, perhaps you remember what happened some years later when Solomon finally finished building, on the day of the temple's dedication, when the ark was brought in. 1 Kings 8 says this, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. You see, that's what the temple was all about. This glorious God dwelling with his people. And so it's striking then to see how this imagery is fulfilled in the New Covenant era. Christians are described as being the temple of the living God, both individually, but especially corporately as a church. 1 Corinthians 3:16, for example, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you? Or Ephesians chapter 2, in him, Christ Jesus, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple to the Lord. And in him, you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. Now, those verses aren't sort of saying that the Old Testament temple equals New Testament church like some sort of mathematical equation. They're simply saying that the underlying reality of the temple is fulfilled in the church. That Jesus is the Word who became flesh and dwelt, tabernacled amongst us. He's God with us, and now his Spirit dwells amongst us, his people, in the church. So that for all of these discontinuities, there's also this great continuity. Just as David's great concern was for building the temple for God's holy name, so our concern is for building the church, for magnifying his holy name in our world to bring glory to his name. You see, when we give to the church, it's not about building our kingdom. but his. Investing our resources in kingdom concerns and looking to the Lord to multiply them for his glory. It's very easy to illustrate that, isn't it? Because we still have last Sunday morning fresh in our minds, don't we? And the great joy around this packed building as 5 friends were baptized. Isn't it glorious to hear their different stories, to hear their baptismal promises, and to see them plunge beneath the waters, and especially in tall Jacob's case, to see him come up as well? You know, new life in Christ, new believers with God's Spirit in them. Well, that's what we give towards, whether with our money or our time or our heartfelt prayers. And we saw 3 teenagers baptized, for example. A return on all our investments in our children, in our youth work. We saw 2 people who've especially benefited from the 1830s group. We saw internationals. Again, a return on our investments there. And we long for similar, don't we, amongst unchurched locals through the Oasis or through seniors or through students or you name it. Because you see, our money is not just filling a hole in some spreadsheet somewhere in the ether. It's being invested in people. It's enabling gospel work to happen. Both bringing the gospel to unbelievers, but also then helping believers mature in their faith. Well, you think what we saw from David and Bertha earlier in Peru. Wasn't that an encouragement to hear all that's going on there? You know, in that part of the world where rich theological training of pastors and others is just so necessary for the maturity and growth of the church. 550 church leaders from 20 countries being well nourished last year. 150 pastors at that preaching conference last week. Well, think of the potential fruit from that. We can't do it ourselves. But what a thrill to be able to partner with people who can. Investing in kingdom growth. You remember what the scriptures say elsewhere. Those who sow generously also reap generously. And that is what we sow for, to reap. We look around us at fields that are ripe for harvest. You know, as we invest, we longingly think to ourselves, well, what if that was my neighbour, or my work colleague, or my relative, or my friend, or what if that money that we give was used in missionary work to the ends of the earth to bring God's kingdom to many who've never heard? Well, what a joy that would be. You see, really, as we give generously, we just join in the divine project. Just as God has given so generously to gather sinners into his kingdom, not even sparing his only begotten Son, but freely giving him up for us all. That's what the Lord's Supper reminds us of this extraordinary generosity. You see, my intent here today is not to somehow beat you up or guilt trip you into giving. You know, you must give more. It's simply to remind you of why we do it. For this worthiest of causes, for your holy name. Our desire is for God's honour, to make the glories of our all-glorious God known. That's what we want, isn't it? As Jesus taught his disciples to pray, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. You know, it's a great joy to me to see how so many of you do this already in so many ways, willingly investing your resources of time and money and energy in spiritually minded ways. At the end of verse 17 has been my experience really since coming to Carey, of how I have seen with joy how willingly your people who are here have given to you. So many of you give your time to serve in the Oasis or at Bridges or in youth work or open airs or so on. So many of you give financially or are interested and involved in other good gospel organisations like CEP or Reach, who we'll be hearing from tonight. Such an encouragement. I thank God for your longing desire to see God's kingdom built through these means, because God's kingdom is important. And yet, as we reach the close, it would be remiss of me not also to ask us just to pause and reflect and ask ourselves, well, what does my giving say about my heart? Yes, giving in all sorts of ways. but especially this morning, our financial giving, according to the resources that the Lord gives us. Someone was once researching to write a biography of the Duke of Wellington, that great victor of the Battle of Waterloo. And the biographer discovered some old cheque stubs that belonged to the Duke, showing how he spent his money. And the biographer went on to say, he said, "When I saw how he spent his money, then I knew the man." And it's the same for us, really. Because where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so whether you can only give the widow's mite, or from great abundance, or somewhere in between, when you ask yourself today, what does my giving say about my heart? Do you ever think about your giving? Do you ever actively revise it, whether up or down? And do you regularly pray that God would use what you give for the extension of his kingdom? Because we really do have every reason to give, don't we? We have an all-glorious God who's so generously given to us, and we want his grace to spread to others for the sake of his holy name. Who are we that we should be able to give so generously to God? May the Lord help us to be such generous people.